At 65 years old, Henry Wallace thought his life was over. A widower drowning in loneliness, he had resigned himself to a quiet, uneventful existence until one night changed everything. In a dimly lit bar near his home, Henry met Adrian, a confident and strikingly handsome 30-year-old. What started as a casual conversation turned into something far deeper, stirring feelings Henry had buried for decades. By the end of the night, an unexpected invitation would lead to a moment of passion Henry never thought possible. But how can a man who spent his life hiding his truth embrace the love he's always craved? And what secrets might Adrian be hiding? Stay until the end to discover a story of love, courage, and a second chance at happiness.
Henry Wallace sat in his quiet kitchen, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now echoed with silence. At 65 years old, Henry was a retired accountant and a widower, carrying the weight of a life that felt half-lived. His wife, Margaret, had been gone for 3 years, and while he mourned her deeply, there was another layer to his sorrow, one he'd never dared to speak aloud. He'd always known he was different, even as a boy. There were stolen glances at classmates, fleeting moments of yearning he never understood at the time. But in the world he grew up in, those feelings were buried beneath expectations and duty. He married Margaret because it was the right thing to do. He had loved her in his own way, but his heart had always harbored a hidden truth. He was attracted to men. For decades, he kept this part of himself locked away, hidden even from his own reflection. That day, the loneliness hit Henry harder than usual. Retirement had stripped him of structure, leaving him with too much time to think. He looked at an old photo of Margaret on the mantel, her kind eyes staring back at him. "You'd want me to be happy, wouldn't you?" he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. But happiness seemed like a distant memory, buried beneath regret and years of pretending. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry felt a strange urge to leave the house, a rare impulse for a man who preferred his routines and solitude. There was a small bar just a few blocks away, one he'd walked past many times but never entered. Tonight, he decided to change that. Grabbing his coat, he stepped into the chilly evening, the crisp air biting at his cheeks as he walked. The bar was dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background and a faint buzz of conversation. Henry hesitated at the door, feeling out of place among the younger crowd. But the thought of returning to his empty house propelled him forward. He slid onto a stool at the far end of the bar, ordering a whiskey neat. The bartender nodded politely, placing the glass in front of him. Henry took a sip, the warmth spreading through his chest, dulling the ache of his loneliness. It was then that he noticed the man a few seats away, a tall muscular figure with dark hair and an effortless air of confidence. He looked to be in his early 30s, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through Henry. Their gazes met briefly, and Henry quickly looked away, his face flushing with embarrassment. He scolded himself for the thought that had flickered in his mind, how attractive the man was, how he made Henry feel something he hadn't felt in decades. To his surprise, the man stood and approached him, sliding onto the stool beside him. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice warm and inviting. Henry hesitated before nodding, unsure of what to say. "I'm Adrian," the man said, extending a hand. Henry shook it, his own hand trembling slightly. "Henry," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Adrian smiled, a genuine, disarming smile that made Henry feel at ease despite himself. "You don't seem like the kind of guy who comes to bars often," Adrian observed. Henry chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're right about that. Just needed to get out of the house tonight." Their conversation began hesitantly but soon flowed with surprising ease. Henry found himself laughing, something he hadn't done in weeks, maybe months. As the evening wore on, Henry couldn't ignore the way Adrian's presence made him feel, alive, seen, and, for the first time in years, hopeful. When Adrian leaned in slightly, his voice low as he asked about Henry's life, Henry felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crack. He had no idea where this connection would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to find out. The whiskey loosened Henry's tongue, and soon he was sharing more of himself with Adrian than he had with anyone in years. It was strange how easily the words flowed, stories about his career as an accountant, his late wife Margaret, and even the stifling routine of his retirement. Adrian listened intently, nodding in all the right places and occasionally throwing in a light-hearted comment that drew a chuckle from Henry. As they talked, Henry couldn't help but notice how Adrian carried himself, confident but not arrogant, charming yet approachable. There was an intensity in his gaze, one that made Henry feel like he was the only person in the room. It was disarming, and Henry found himself lowering his guard with every passing minute. For a man who had spent decades hiding his true self, it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "Do you come here often?" Henry asked, trying to keep the conversation casual, though his voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. Adrian smiled, sipping his beer before answering. "Sometimes. I like places where I can actually hear myself think. It's rare to find someone worth talking to, though." His eyes lingered on Henry for a moment, and Henry felt a flutter in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his youth. Henry shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to interpret Adrian's words. Was it just friendly banter? Or was there something more to it? The thought made his heart race, and he quickly took another sip of whiskey to steady himself. Adrian, sensing Henry's unease, leaned back slightly and changed the subject. "What about you, Henry? What brought you here tonight?" Henry hesitated, staring into his glass as he searched for the right words. "I guess, I just got tired of being alone," he admitted, his voice quieter now. It was the closest he'd come to expressing the truth of his situation. Adrian nodded, his expression softening. "I get that. Loneliness can be a heavy thing to carry." Their conversation deepened as the hours slipped by unnoticed. Adrian spoke about his own life, his work as a personal trainer, his love of fitness, and how he'd moved to the city a few years ago for a fresh start. There was a vulnerability in his voice when he mentioned his struggles with relationships, and Henry felt a pang of empathy. It was a rare thing to connect with someone so openly, and it made him feel both comforted and exposed. As the bar began to empty, the bartender signaled last call, and Henry realized just how late it had gotten. The thought of returning to his empty house filled him with dread, but he couldn't bring himself to end the night just yet. Adrian, who had clearly enjoyed a few more drinks than Henry, swayed slightly as he stood. "Guess it's time to head out," Adrian said with a sheepish grin. Henry hesitated for a moment before making a bold decision. "You've had a bit to drink," he said, trying to keep his tone casual. "Why don't you stay at my place tonight? It's just a short walk from here, and I'd hate for you to drive in this condition." Adrian raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the offer, but then he smiled warmly. "That's kind of you, Henry. I'd appreciate that." The walk to Henry's house was quiet but comfortable, the cool night air sobering them both. Henry couldn't help but feel a mix of nervousness and excitement as they approached his front door. When they stepped inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them, and Henry suddenly felt the vulnerability of inviting someone into his personal space. As he turned to offer Adrian a blanket for the couch, he was caught off guard by the intensity in Adrian's eyes. Before Henry could react, Adrian closed the space between them, his hands gently resting on Henry's shoulders. "I've felt something tonight I haven't felt in a long time," Adrian said, his voice low and filled with sincerity. And then, without hesitation, he leaned in, pressing his lips to Henry's in a kiss that was both tender and electric. Henry's breath caught, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. But as Adrian deepened the kiss, the years of denial and fear melted away, leaving only the raw, unfiltered truth of what he'd always wanted. For the first time in his life, Henry allowed himself to feel without restraint, and it was as if a weight he'd carried for decades had finally been lifted. Henry's mind was a whirlwind of emotions as Adrian's lips met his. He hadn't felt a kiss like this in decades, if ever. There was an honesty in the moment that shook him to his core. The kiss was unhurried, Adrian's lips soft yet firm, igniting a warmth in Henry that he thought had died long ago. He pulled back slightly, his breath unsteady as he looked into Adrian's eyes. "Are you sure about this?" Henry whispered, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Adrian smiled, his hands gently resting on Henry's shoulders. "I've never been more sure of anything," he replied, his voice steady and full of conviction. Henry felt his resolve waver as he let himself be drawn back into another kiss, this one deeper, more urgent, as though years of pent-up feelings were finally being released. Adrian's hands moved to Henry's face, cradling him with surprising tenderness. For a man who exuded confidence and strength, there was an unexpected gentleness in Adrian's touch that made Henry's heart ache. He allowed himself to surrender, to feel for the first time without shame or hesitation. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The two men moved toward the living room, where Henry's familiar furniture and surroundings suddenly felt transformed. Adrian guided Henry to the couch, sitting beside him and never breaking eye contact. "You've been holding so much back," Adrian said softly. "I can see it in your eyes. But you don't have to anymore." The words hit Henry like a tidal wave. He felt tears welling up as the weight of decades of suppression and loneliness came crashing down. "I've spent my whole life hiding," Henry admitted, his voice trembling. I didn't think I'd ever get the chance to feel this. Adrian reached out, taking Henry's hand in his. It's never too late, he said simply. You deserve to be happy, Henry. To be loved for who you are. The vulnerability in Adrian's words struck a chord in Henry. He had spent so long denying himself, convinced that his time for love and connection had passed. But here was Adrian, looking at him with an intensity that made him feel seen for the first time. It was overwhelming but also liberating. Their conversation wove between moments of laughter and quiet reflection, both men sharing parts of themselves they rarely revealed to others. Henry spoke of his years with Margaret, the good times and the unspoken truths. Adrian shared his own struggles with self-acceptance and the loneliness that often accompanied his confident exterior. The hours slipped by, and by the time the first hints of dawn began to break through the curtains, neither man had any intention of letting the moment end. Adrian shifted closer, his hand brushing against Henry's cheek. I don't want this to be just one night, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to know you, Henry, all of you. Henry felt his chest tighten with emotion. The idea of someone wanting him, truly wanting him, was almost too much to comprehend. But as he looked into Adrian's eyes, he knew he couldn't let fear hold him back anymore. Then stay, Henry said, his voice steady for the first time. Stay with me. Adrian's smile was radiant as he leaned in for another kiss, sealing the promise of something neither of them had expected but both desperately needed. For the first time in years, Henry felt hope, a fragile, beautiful hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find love again. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the living room. Henry stirred awake, his body still nestled in the warmth of Adrian's embrace. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. But as he opened his eyes and saw Adrian's peaceful face, reality hit him like a wave. Last night had truly happened. Adrian's arm tightened slightly around Henry as he shifted, his eyes fluttering open. Good morning, he said, his voice deep and husky from sleep. Henry blushed, feeling a surge of emotions he hadn't experienced in years. Good morning, he replied, his voice soft and almost shy. Adrian sat up, stretching his muscular frame. I hope I didn't overstay my welcome, he said with a teasing smile. Henry chuckled nervously, his heart racing. Not at all, I actually enjoyed having company for a change. The words felt inadequate to describe the whirlwind of emotions he was feeling, but they were the best he could manage. The two men moved to the kitchen, where Henry prepared coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he poured. Adrian leaned against the counter, watching him with an amused expression. You know, Adrian said, you're different from anyone I've met before. Henry raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to take the comment as a compliment. Different how? He asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. Adrian shrugged, his smile softening. You're real, honest. You're not trying to impress anyone or pretend to be something you're not. I like that about you. Henry felt his cheeks flush again, the sincerity in Adrian's words catching him off guard. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to him like this, and he didn't quite know how to respond. As they sipped their coffee, the conversation flowed naturally, just as it had the night before. Adrian shared more about his life. How he'd moved to the city to escape a toxic relationship, how he was still searching for a sense of belonging. Henry listened intently, feeling a growing connection with this man who had so unexpectedly entered his life. By the time they finished their coffee, the tension in the air had shifted. Adrian reached out, his hand brushing against Henry's. I meant what I said last night, Adrian said, his voice steady. I don't want this to be just one night. I want to see where this can go if you're open to it. Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. Part of him wanted to retreat, to hide behind the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. But another part of him, the part that had longed for connection and love, knew he couldn't let this opportunity slip away. I'd like that, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Adrian smiled, his hand squeezing Henry's gently. Then let's take it one step at a time, he said. No pressure, no expectations. Just us. Henry nodded, a small but genuine smile spreading across his face. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile but undeniable sense that perhaps, just perhaps, he could find happiness again. As they cleared their mugs and began planning their day, Henry couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in such a short time. Adrian's presence felt like a spark of light in the darkness, and though he didn't know where this journey would lead, he was finally ready to embrace it. The rest of the day unfolded with a sense of ease that Henry hadn't felt in years. After breakfast, Adrian insisted on helping tidy up the kitchen, teasing Henry about the assortment of gadgets that hadn't seen use in years. The playful banter between them felt natural, as though they'd known each other much longer than the brief span of a single night. As the hours passed, Henry found himself glancing at Adrian often, still trying to process the events of the previous night and the morning's quiet intimacy. It wasn't just the kiss or the connection they had shared, it was the realization that, for the first time, he was confronting the part of himself he'd buried for decades. The thought was thrilling and terrifying all at once. When Adrian finally decided to head back to his apartment to freshen up, he lingered at the door, his fingers brushing against Henry's as they said their goodbyes. "I'll call you later, okay?" Adrian said, his voice warm and full of promise. Henry nodded, watching as Adrian walked down the street, his confident stride leaving Henry with a smile he couldn't quite shake. Alone again, Henry sank into his favorite armchair, his thoughts racing. He stared at the empty fireplace, the quiet of the house settling around him. The past was a heavy presence in the room, and memories of his late wife, Margaret, began to resurface. Guilt crept in as he thought about her, about the life they had built together. "What would she think of me now?" he whispered aloud. But deep down, Henry knew that Margaret had always wanted him to be happy. She had often told him to embrace life fully, to chase joy wherever it could be found. Her words echoed in his mind as he realized that perhaps, this moment with Adrian was what she would have wanted for him. It didn't erase the guilt entirely, but it gave him a small measure of peace. Later that afternoon, Henry found himself drawn to the attic. Among the dust-covered boxes of old photographs and keepsakes, he unearthed a journal he hadn't opened in decades. Its worn leather cover and yellowed pages held fragments of a younger Henry, his thoughts, fears and longings from a time when he had no one to confide in. Flipping through the pages, he came across an entry from his early 20s. It was raw and vulnerable, filled with confessions of feelings for another young man he had worked with briefly. "I can never tell anyone." The entry read. "This part of me has to stay hidden." Henry ran his fingers over the words, feeling a pang of sadness for the man he had been, the man who had felt so alone in his truth. As he closed the journal and set it aside, Henry felt a strange sense of clarity. He couldn't change the past, but he could choose how he wanted to live the rest of his life. Adrian had opened a door, and for the first time, Henry was willing to step through it, even if it meant facing the fears and insecurities that had held him back for so long. By the time evening fell, Henry's resolve had strengthened. He picked up his phone and stared at the screen for a moment before dialing Adrian's number. The sound of Adrian's voice on the other end filled him with a warmth he hadn't realized he'd been missing. "Hey," Adrian said, his tone cheerful. "I was just about to call you." Henry smiled, his heart steadying. "How about dinner tomorrow night?" he asked, his voice carrying a newfound confidence. Adrian's laughter came through the line, light and genuine. "I'd love that," he replied. As they made their plans, Henry couldn't help but feel that this was the start of something he never thought he'd have, a chance to live fully, to love without fear. The following evening, Henry stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt for what felt like the 100th time. His nerves were buzzing with a mix of excitement and apprehension. It had been years since he'd gone on what could be considered a date, and even then, it had been nothing like this. The man waiting for him wasn't just another dinner companion. Adrian represented a new beginning, one Henry wasn't sure he was ready for but desperately wanted to embrace. When Adrian arrived, the sight of him took Henry's breath away. Dressed in a casual but perfectly tailored button-up shirt and jeans, Adrian's confident demeanor was matched by the warm smile he gave Henry as he stepped inside. "You look great," Adrian said, his eyes scanning Henry appreciatively. Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "You're too kind, I just threw something on." Adrian leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "You don't give yourself enough credit, Henry. You've got a charm that's hard to ignore." The words sent a flush to Henry's cheeks, and he looked away, smiling despite himself. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades, being wanted, seen and appreciated. They headed to a cozy restaurant a few blocks away, one Henry had always passed but never visited. The atmosphere was intimate, with soft lighting and the quiet hum of conversation around them. As they sat down, Henry found himself relaxing, the warmth of Adrian's presence calming his nerves. Their conversation flowed as easily as it had at the bar, each story and shared laugh deepening the connection between them. Adrian talked about his dreams of opening his own fitness studio, his love of helping others achieve their goals, and the challenges of building something from the ground up. Henry listened intently, captivated not just by Adrian's ambition but by the passion that lit up his face as he spoke. "You have a way of making people feel like they can do anything," Henry said, his voice sincere. Adrian smiled, reaching across the table to touch Henry's hand briefly. "And you have a way of making me feel like I can be myself." Henry's heart swelled at the words. He had spent so much of his life pretending, hiding, and denying himself that the idea of someone seeing him as he truly was felt almost unreal. But with Adrian, it was different. There was no judgment, no pressure, just an openness that made Henry feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. As the evening wore on, They shared a bottle of wine and lingered over dessert, neither wanting the night to end. When the check came, Adrian reached for it, but Henry stopped him. "Let me," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Adrian smiled, nodding in agreement. "All right, but next time it's on me." The walk back to Henry's house was quiet but filled with an unspoken energy. The crisp night air was refreshing, and the closeness of Adrian beside him felt comforting. When they reached the door, Adrian hesitated, his hands in his pockets. "I had a great time tonight," he said, his voice soft. Henry smiled, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions. "So did I." Before either of them could overthink it, Adrian closed the gap between them, his hand gently cupping Henry's face as he leaned in for a kiss. It was tender, slow, and filled with a depth that made Henry's heart race. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian looked into Henry's eyes and smiled. "I don't want this to be the last time," he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. Henry's voice caught in his throat as he nodded. "It doesn't have to be he replied. In that moment, standing on his doorstep under the glow of the porch light, Henry felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of belonging, of hope, and of a future he never thought possible. The days following their dinner felt like a whirlwind for Henry. His once monotonous routine had been replaced by a vibrant new rhythm, one that revolved around Adrian. They spent their evenings talking for hours, whether on the phone or at Henry's house, and Adrian's presence quickly became a fixture in Henry's life. For the first time in years, Henry felt truly alive. Still, Henry couldn't help but wrestle with his own insecurities. The age difference between them weighed heavily on his mind, and he found himself questioning why someone as young, confident and handsome as Adrian would be interested in him. Adrian, however, never gave Henry any reason to doubt his intentions. He was attentive, kind, and genuine in a way that Henry found both reassuring and disarming. One evening, as they sat on the couch with a bottle of wine between them, Henry finally voiced the question that had been haunting him. "Why me?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Adrian looked at him, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" Henry sighed, looking down at his hands. "You're young, successful, and full of life. I'm just an old man who's spent most of his life hiding. I don't understand what you see in me." Adrian set his glass down and turned to face Henry, his expression serious but warm. "Henry, do you know what I see when I look at you?" he asked. Henry shook his head, unsure of how to respond. Adrian reached out, taking Henry's hand in his. "I see a man who's kind, intelligent, and has a depth that most people don't. You've lived a life full of stories and experiences that I admire. And more than that, you make me feel understood in a way no one else ever has." Henry felt his chest tighten with emotion. "But the age difference," he began, but Adrian cut him off with a gentle squeeze of his hand. "I don't care about that," Adrian said firmly. "You're the one I want to be with, Henry. Age doesn't change that." The sincerity in Adrian's voice brought tears to Henry's eyes. He had spent so much of his life believing he wasn't worthy of love, that his true self was something to be hidden away. But Adrian saw him, truly saw him, and accepted him for who he was. It was a feeling Henry had never thought he would experience, and it overwhelmed him. That night, as they sat together in the warmth of Henry's living room, Adrian pulled him close, wrapping his arms around him in a comforting embrace. Henry allowed himself to relax into the moment, letting go of the doubts and fears that had held him back for so long. For the first time, he felt like he could truly be himself. Adrian stayed the night again, and as they lay together in the quiet of Henry's bedroom, Henry found himself thinking about the future. For so long, he had believed that his life was essentially over, that his best years were behind him. But now, with Adrian by his side, the possibilities felt endless. Before drifting off to sleep, Adrian spoke softly, his voice filled with affection. "You make me happy, Henry," he said. "I hope you know that." Henry smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and joy. "You make me happy too," he replied, his voice steady and full of emotion. As they lay there, wrapped in each other's warmth, Henry realized something profound. It wasn't too late to find love. It wasn't too late to live the life he had always dreamed of but never dared to pursue. And with Adrian beside him, he was ready to embrace whatever the future held. The morning light filled the room as Henry woke up beside Adrian, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Over coffee, Adrian suggested a walk through the park. Hand in hand, they strolled, laughing and sharing stories. For the first time, Henry didn't care who saw them, he felt free. On the porch that evening, Adrian smiled and said, "Let's build something real." Henry nodded, his heart full. "I'm ready." Adrian moved in, and the quiet house became a home filled with laughter and love. One evening on the porch, Adrian said, "I love you." Henry's eyes filled with tears as he replied, I love you too. Together, they proved it's never too late to find happiness, building a life of love and joy side by side. What did you think of Henry and Adrian's heartfelt journey? On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? Your feedback is so important. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Did their unexpected love inspire you? Did you connect with Henry's struggles or Adrian's warmth? Let us know. We'd love to hear how this story touched you and what moments stood out the most. Your input helps us create even more impactful stories.